The adopted daughter begged in tears when her stepmother pushed her, until the billionaire shouted. The words landed in the room like a dropped glass. Crystal chimed against crystal. Conversation thinned to a single, stunned silence. A little girl on the edge of the central table sat cradling a plastic cup of juice, fingers slippery with condensation. Her dress was a pale blue that matched the shy light catching the chandelier. She blinked, held the cup to her chest, and the tears began. Slow at first, then rushing, washing a small, terrified face that had learned to apologize before she understood why anyone was angry. Cristiane Almeida stood over her, impeccable, cold as the marble floor beneath the guests. Her smile when she noticed the hush stayed professional, practiced. A murmur from someone about spilled drinks. A staff member reached for a napkin. No one moved toward the child. Then Roberto Mendes turned. The movement came from across the room, an abrupt, cutting pivot that radiated authority and habit. He saw the fall, the tears, the way Cristiane's hand had closed too firmly around the girl's arm. The billionaire's voice was neither quiet nor composed. It tore through the hush like wind through glass. Enough. It was not a question. The words shoved back the air, redirected everyone's attention. Servers froze mid-step. The orchestra softened a chord. Guests swallowed and looked at the Mendes table, where the polished image of a family had cracked open for a second. Marina Silva, standing near the floral arrangements because she had been volunteering all evening, watched the scene with a gaze shaped by training and a gnawing familiarity. She had seen children apologize for things they never should have been blamed for. She had seen adults smooth over incidents and call them accidents. She was an assistant social worker. The language of small injuries and sudden silences was a language she read without subtext. Her hand moved to her notebook automatically. Her pen wrote 3 words with the steadiness of someone writing a prescription. Isabella Mendes. Possible risk. That single extra beat, writing instead of laughing it off, separated what would remain denial from what might become truth. Marina kept her eyes on the Mendes family as the moment closed. Roberto sat back, his posture returning to composed. Cristiane resumed her smile as if nothing had happened. The party moved on, the music swelling to fill the emptiness. Marina stayed a moment longer, listening to the rustle of gowns and the polite reintroduction of small talk. The charity gala glittered around a wound. She folded her notebook into her purse and watched the child one last time, noticing how Isabella kept her hands close to her body, how she lingered near the adult who was not her mother, the housekeeper who hovered like a shadow, Donna Maria. Those are the details that live with you. They do not always make for immediate drama, but they tell a story that will not stay quiet. Marina did not go to the Mendes table that night. She finished her volunteer shift, took the long bus home, and let the city's amber lights raise away the party's sheen. In bed, she reviewed the images she kept of the evening on a small recorder in her bag. The sound of the glass, Isabella's plea, the sharp command from Roberto. It was not an audio that could convict, but it preserved a tone. She emailed the note to the Child Protection Hotline with a succinct cover. Observation at Charity Gala. Request for school check. 2 days later, she sat across from Luciana Santos in a small, overwarm room lined with colorful posters that tried to teach empathy through animated animals. Luciana was Isabella's teacher. The woman's eyes were soft and tired in equal measure. She had been the one who had first called the council weeks earlier after noticing a pattern. A girl who retreated into the back row, who kept papers hidden in her desk, who came in with heavy-lidded reluctance after weekends with her stepmother. "We called the council," Luciana said, placing a thin file on the table. "But with the Mendes name involved, everything gets complicated fast." Marina opened the file. The handwriting inside belonged to a child's hands. If children learned violence the way they learned to draw, her pages told of quiet dinings and stories folded into the dark. There were teacher notes, observations about bruises that were described clinically, small, circular, along the forearm, not graphic but consistent with repeated pressure. Attendance logs showed art projects unfinished, a decline in participation. Isabella herself sat in a chair by the window of the school's meeting room. She was 7, if the files were correct. Up close she seemed smaller, as if someone had compressed a childhood into a tiny, fragile shape. She held tight to a worn, stuffed rabbit and watched Marina with the careful suspicion a child has when adults gather behind serious faces. Marina had learned long ago how to make a child understand safety without being frightened by the process. She lowered her voice, kept her questions simple, and let the little girl set the pace. She did not push for details that would carve open a wound. She listened for patterns, for consistency. "Did you fall at the party?" Marina asked gently. Isabella's eyes darted to the door, then to the cup of juice she still imagined in her fist. "I spilled juice," she whispered. "I said sorry." "Who did you say sorry to?" "My... Cristiane?" The name landed like a stone in Marina's stomach. A stepmother's name does not prove anything, but the way the child said it did. Soft, resigned, like someone reciting a rule she'd learned to live by. Every social worker has a list of phrases that make them sit up. "It's my fault. I shouldn't have." She gets angry. The list was never complete, but it was telling. Marina wrote carefully in her notebook. Consistent account, child apologetic, visible anxiety, refer for medical assessment, request witness statements. Luciana confirmed that she had sent photographs of the child's drawings, dark houses, small figures behind tall walls. Kids draw what they can't say, she offered without dramatics. I've seen other signs before. We tried to be careful because the parents they have influence. But when you see the same pattern over and over, you have to push. Marina left the school with a plan. The protocol was clear in its steps and unambiguous in its priority: safety. She initiated a formal referral. She called the pediatric clinic and requested a non-urgent medical exam to document physical signs. She arranged for Dr. Patricia Vasconcelos, a child psychologist with a reputation for careful, evidence-based assessments, to meet with Isabella in a protected setting. She drafted witness interview requests and a record preservation letter to the school so nothing could be altered. At the core of the plan was documentation. In cases that involved power, documentation is the scaffolding that holds a child's voice steady when adults shake the foundation. But documentation requires courage from those who stand in the shadows. Donna Maria, the Mendes family's housekeeper, would be the first bridging witness. Marina knew that. She had watched Donna Maria from the doorway that night, hands folded, eyes like someone who keeps secrets to survive. If a brave hand opened, it would be a small one, hidden under a long sleeve. A week after the gala, Marina knocked on the heavy, ornate door of the Mendes residence. The house wore its affluence like a polished exterior: gleaming stone, sculpted hedges, cameras that blinked as though they had nothing to hide. The intercom buzzed. A voice asked who she was. Marina said she was from Child Protective Services and had an appointment with the housekeeper. The voice told her to wait. Cristiane answered the door. She was all posture and perfume, hair arranged like the waves of a statue. Her smile was immediate and the kind used to close deals. "We had a little incident," she said, almost rehearsed. "I hope this is nothing." Marina introduced herself and followed a small woman in a plain uniform down a corridor that smelled of citrus cleaner and expensive wood. Donna Maria was older than Marina expected, her hands calloused, her voice a soft thread. For a long moment she would not look up. "I can't speak here," Donna Maria murmured in Portuguese, sliding a small folded photograph into Marina's hand when no one else was in the pantry. "I can lose my job. They have lawyers. They call me too many names. But the girl? She cries." The photograph was harmless at first glance. A child sitting at a low table, a dark smudge at her forearm. The picture's significance came from context, timestamps that matched nights. Cristiane said she was out, small details in the background that matched the house. Donna Maria's hands trembled as she gave Marina a memory card tucked into the hem of her apron. "Is there more?" Marina asked softly. Donna Maria nodded, eyes bright with fear. "Sometimes I hear, at night. She cries and apologizes and then quiet. I put my ear by the door." She lowered her voice. "I recorded once. I thought, no one will believe me. But now, this was the hinge moment all investigators crave. A witness willing to risk the small but crushing losses of speaking up." Marina's training taught her to be measured. She thanked Donna Maria, explained the protections she could try to secure: a pseudonym for testimony, the possibility of witness protection in the narrow sense the system allows, and promised to return with official papers. Donna Maria's relief was private and immediate, like a person suddenly allowed to breathe. Back at the office, Marina listened to the recording in a room that smelled of coffee and rain. The audio was ordinary at first: the hum of a refrigerator, the distant tick of a clock. Then a small, strained voice, an indistinct apology, then a low, hard tone that could be a rebuke. The recording was partial, muffled, ambiguous in places. Alone, it would be interpreted in different ways. Paired with the photographs, the teacher's notes, and the child's consistent account, however, it turned from possibility into a thread of corroboration. She copied the file to secure storage. She called Eduardo Ferreira, a lawyer who had given his time pro bono to similar cases. Eduardo had a manner that combined legal precision with plain-speaking warmth. "We will need chain of custody," he said on their first call, not unkindly. "We will need witnesses who will sit for depositions. But please do not share the recording publicly. Power thrives on spectacle, and the Mendes estate can make a spectacle of anything." They agreed on next steps: formal evidence collection, medical and psychological assessment, ensuring the child's immediate safety plans, and discreet management of any press interest. Marina's note-taking was meticulous, each step time-stamped and logged. This process was slow, meticulous, bureaucratic, intentionally so. Speed could be reckless, sloppiness could be fatal. Word traveled more quickly than procedure, however. The Mendes family's communications team, slick, fast, practiced in deflecting scrutiny, issued a statement lauding Cristiane's humanitarian work and Roberto's commitment to family values. The statement did not mention Isabella. It framed the gala as a triumph for their charitable foundation. A lifestyle magazine profiled Cristiane the next day. Photos of laughter, a piece about rehabilitation programs, a headline about grace under pressure. The press plateaued on the image the Mendes team cultivated. In the daylight, the house gleamed. The first pushback came not as a shout, but as a paper shield. A letter from a law firm landed on Marina's desk, a polite but firm demand that any allegations be withdrawn and that any unauthorized recordings be surrendered. It quoted defamation law. Its tone was cold-blooded and precise. It was designed to make anyone who feared consequences step back. Marina wrote back with quiet accuracy. She described the steps she had taken, the protocols she followed, the referral to the council, the request for medical assessment, and the child's ongoing vulnerability. She did not boast. She did not leak. She documented. The letter, however, had achieved part of its purpose. Donna Maria received a visit from a man who said he had been sent to check whether she was being taken care of, followed later by a well-dressed woman who asked her about loyalty and fear under the pretense of offering assistance. A neighbor received a message about unpaid parking tickets that were suddenly resolved by a private assistant at the residence. Subtle things. Pressure applied in such a way that witnesses felt their margins narrow. Carlos Nascimento, an investigative reporter Marina had met in an unrelated case years prior, called. He had heard rumors. He wanted to know if there was truth behind the gossip. He did not promise public exposure. He promised careful reporting. Power, he said, is most dangerous when it's left in the dark. He offered to run background checks, to canvass the neighborhood for corroboration, and to keep the story from exploding until the evidence was ready. With allies in place, Marina felt the ledger of safety even as the line of fire warmed. She arranged for an expedited pediatric exam. The doctor, professional and unflinching, documented signs of chronic stress, a flattened affect in the child's interactions, sleep disturbances noted by the caregiver, and small marks the size and pattern of a repeated grip. Not graphic, not diagnostic of any single event. But the pattern added to the tapestry, drawings that echoed fear, a voice that apologized, photographs that captured a bruise's contour. Patricia's evaluation would demand a separate appointment in a child-focused setting. When she met Isabella, she used play as conversation, letting the child's narratives unfurl in stories about animals and houses. There are ways to ask without prying, ways to listen without making promises that cannot be kept. Patricia's notes were clinical and precise. Consistent signs of anxiety, narratives contain repeated themes of submission and fear, rapport building continues. She recommended therapeutic support and cautioned that the child's testimony, if needed in court, would require careful preparation and protective measures. By this stage, a pattern had formed, corroborating threads that, when woven together, presented a picture stronger than any one piece alone. But power has other resources. Cristiane's lawyers began to call the school directly. An anonymous luxury magazine featured an op-ed praising the family's commitment to children's causes. The piece's author had connections to the Mendes philanthropic network. Someone forwarded a message to Marina's supervisor, hinting at overreach on her part. Reckless allegations against a reputable family, risking defamation suits. The message was unsigned, but it carried the weight of a note dropped in the right ear. Threats in these situations seldom come as threats. They are a series of small inconveniences and whispered consequences arranged like a noose. Witnesses get nervous. Donna Maria's quiet courage started to fray. The housekeeper called Marina late one night from a payphone, breath trembling. "They say I might be fired. They say if I talk I will lose everything. I'm scared." "We will protect you as best we can," Marina promised, though she felt the promise press against the limitations of the system. Protection is arduous in the face of wealth. It is a patchwork of legal orders and human presence and, too often, daring. Marina increased her presence. She coordinated with Eduardo to draft a protective letter for Donna Maria and to arrange a safe temporary placement, should the housekeeper decide to testify. Eduardo also advised on how to secure the recording's chain of custody and how to subpoena digital data without exposing the child to publicity. The legal strategy was meticulous. Avoid the headlines, build the case, but secrecy cannot be absolute. An article appeared in an online tabloid with the Mendes name, the tone coy. Whispers at a gala, what really happened? The piece was thin on facts and heavy on insinuation. Comments proliferated beneath it, some venomous, some suspiciously supportive of the family. Marina began to receive messages, some civil, some cruel, on social channels. Someone called her supervisor again. Pressure mounted. It was during one of those late nights, when Marina sat in the small office that smelled of toner and lemon coffee, that a memory card rested on her palm like a weight. Donna Maria had given her more than she first admitted. A second memory card, this one labeled in faint, careful handwriting with the date of the gala. It contained a short, shaky video. Isabella at the table, Cristiane reaching toward her, the small push, the child falling and crying, Roberto's shout, the single syllable of intervention. The clip was the visual echo of what Marina had witnessed from afar. Closer, clearer. Marina played the clip once, twice. each viewing tightened a knot in her chest. The footage was not a courtroom-quality recording. It was a domestic artifact, the little camera angle, the soft whir of background music, the muffled conversation. But it was real, and in her training she knew real is often all you need to begin. She copied the file into secure storage and labeled it. She logged every movement. Eduardo arranged to have a verified forensic copy made, to ensure the file could be authenticated. Carlos promised to hold any public use until advised. The next morning, an envelope arrived at Marina's desk. It contained a glossy invitation, no handwriting, no return address, inviting her to a private dinner hosted by a philanthropic circle associated with the Mendes Foundation. The card's tone was hospitable and preoccupied with the image of reconciliation. It might have been an honest invite. It might have been a soft warning. The ambiguity grated. She did not attend. Instead, Marina called her supervisor and laid out each piece. The gala, Isabella's account, the teacher's notes, the photographs, the audio, Donna Maria's testimony, the medical note, the recording on the memory card. She asked that the agency prepare a risk assessment team. She asked for legal cover for the witnesses. She asked for a plain fact. Children do not wait for perfect proof. They wait for adults who will listen and build scaffolds around them. The agency convened a meeting. It was a room of coffee-stained forms, blinking fluorescent light, and the soft hum of bureaucracy that somehow always gets things done. They agreed to file for an emergency measure if the child's safety appeared compromised. They coordinated with Eduardo on restraining options and with the local police liaison for technical support. There was consensus on one point: the case would be handled with discretion. Discretion, however, is fragile in a world with cameras. A freelance photographer took a picture outside the school of Marina walking out with her notebook. The photo found its way online with a caption that questioned her motives. The Mendes lobby team used the image to suggest interference, an insinuation that sought to flip the narrative. It was effective, and for a few days the emotional labor of the case shifted into the margins. People began to ask if Marina had overstepped, whether the little girl was being used in a tug-of-war staged by those who wanted influence. Marina learned then the double bind of her work. The more she pressed for protection, the more visible the child could become. The more visible the child, the more likely the story could be weaponized against the very people trying to protect her. It was a calculus without neat solutions. At home, when exhaustion loosened her grip on the day, Marina would think of Isabella's apology in her small, frantic hands. She would think of Donna Maria's thin, brave voice, the low thud of the recording, the way Roberto's shout had interrupted a room full of indifference. She would think of how quickly power could direct attention away from the vulnerable, and she would sit at her kitchen table and plan the next step. That step came in the form of a subpoena Eduardo filed quietly, asking the house's security team for footage of the gala. He requested a copy for forensic examination. It was a standard legal maneuver. You do not rely on whispers when you can get a record. The subpoena, however, reached the Mendes legal counsel. The response was swift and stern. The counsel argued for privacy rights, for the sanctity of private events, for the protection of a family's reputation. They did not deny every aspect. They argued instead that any footage would be misleading and that any allegations should be withdrawn to avoid unnecessary harm. Weeks stretched and the pace soured into a trench of waiting and waiting. Donna Maria's courage flickered again under the strain. A sympathetic neighbor told Marina that a truck had been seen idling near the house at night, an intimidation tactic used to remind witnesses of the family's reach. The neighbor hid the detail in a casual remark, not wanting to be drawn into a firefight. One evening, when the city sky turned a bruised color and rain smeared the streetlights, Marina sat with Carlos at a small cafe. He had brought a folder of documents, scanned articles, and his own notes. "If this goes to court," he said, stirring his coffee, "you will need more than a recording and a pattern. Judges look for certainty, for expert voices that cannot be dismissed as hearsay." "We have experts," Marina replied. "We have a pediatrician, a psychologist, the teacher, the housekeeper, and the child. It's a chain. The problem is the strength of their resources. They will try to drown our chain with noise." Carlos nodded. "Then we must make sure the chain is clean, no loose ends, and you need to protect your witnesses. Public pressure works both ways." They planned the next moves with the slow, stubborn care of people who build something in the dark. For Marina, the case had become more than a file. It had become a moral thread pulling her through the nights. For Carlos, it was the kind of story that defined a career. For Eduardo, it was a test of whether law could still be a shield for the vulnerable against concentrated power. The first real crack in the opposition came not from a courtroom or a headline, but from a small, forgotten camera angle that had been overlooked. The forensic team returned with a finding. The memory card's metadata matched the house's network timestamps. The clip was authenticated. The recording had not been tampered with. It was, in legal terms, a tiny victory, an objective nod that would allow the file to move forward. The same morning the forensic report arrived, Marina received a message that pulled the air out of her chest. An unmarked envelope, inside a business card without a logo. The card bore a single line: "We can make this go away." There was no signature. There was no address. The implication was clear. Marina looked at the card and at the file on her desk. The sequence of events, party, shove, child's tears, the billionaire's shout, the camp of litigation and public relations, folded back on itself. She felt the small, private weight of all the people who had trusted her. The teacher who had made a call. Donna Maria who had given a recording at risk to herself. The child who apologized before she knew what to call what happened. Marina put the card in a file labeled Evidence. She took a breath and wrote a note. Proceed. Do not cave. Protect witnesses. Schedule hearing. She typed the note into an email and sent it to Eduardo and Carlos. Then she turned the lights off in the office and walked into the rainy evening. Outside, a man in an umbrella passed, his silhouette a shadow against the lit windows. Marina pulled her coat tighter, feeling the cold and the press of obligation. She thought of Roberto's shout, which in that first moment had seemed to be a guardrail against further harm. She thought of power's many faces. The sudden shout that can rescue a child in public, and the quiet machinery that can erase the same child's voice in private. As she moved through the wet streets, her phone vibrated. It was Donna Maria. The housekeeper's voice cracked. They sent someone to the neighborhood. They asked about me. I'm scared. Marina's reply was immediate. Stay where you are. We will come to you. Do not let them in. Eduardo is on his way. She did not tell Donna Maria that she had received an anonymous card. She did not tell her that the forensic report was her only leverage against litigation finesse. She only said what was true. She was coming. In the small hours, with the city's hum a distant chord, Marina sat in the car with Donna Maria, wrapped in a blanket on the passenger seat. The woman's hands were small and knotted with years of work. She clutched the rabbit of a child she cared for like something holy. Why did you stay so long? Marina asked, not accusatory, but searching for comprehension. People stay in dangerous homes for complicated reasons. Loyalty, economics, fear, shame. Each reason complicates rescue. Donna Maria looked out at the low-slung lights of the street. When you see with your eyes and you think you will be thrown away if you speak. You learn to close your mouth, she said. But the girl's eyes, I cannot forget. Marina felt the quiet resolve of the woman and vowed, again, to be the kind of adult who would not let that silence stand. They drove back to the agency headquarters where Eduardo had arranged a temporary room for Donna Maria and where the social services team could begin to put a protective net in place. The next days moved in a slow, kinetic rhythm. Appointments, paperwork, protective affidavits. Every step forward was met with a counter-pressure. A glossy piece in a lifestyle magazine, a discreet donation to a neighborhood clinic in Cristiane's name, an email to the school raising questions about professional conduct. The Mendoza-esque PR machine was easing into its role, to protect until the storm passed. In the handling of such storms, the first public confrontation is significant. Marina knew that if the case became public prematurely, it would be she and the child who would bear the first wave. So she and her team were methodical, consolidated evidence, closed circuits of trust, and legal readiness. And yet, not everything waits for readiness. A short video clip leaked, an excerpt of the original memory card, uploaded anonymously to a social platform with no context, no timestamps, and a bitter title that invited outrage. The clip's partial nature allowed opposing narratives to flourish. Some viewers assumed a staged fall. Others saw only the child's fear. The pile-on began. Trolls and sympathizers alike poured commentary into the anonymous void. Marina sat with Eduardo and Carlos and watched the public's quick hunger for black and white answers. They'll try to paint us as crusaders, Eduardo said, or opportunists. Either way, the child loses. Carlos, who had watched headlines devour people whole, simply said, "We need control of the narrative without spectacle. Facts, not fury." They tightened their circle. They corroborated documentation, prepared protective petitions, and scheduled a preliminary hearing to request emergency custody. The hearing would not be the final answer, but it could buy the child space, time, and physical safety to let the legal process do its work. As the hearing date approached, the pressure sharpened. Cristiane's attorneys served motions that sought to exclude certain evidence. Their legal lawyers were precise and aimed to complicate the chain of custody. At the same time, the family's private security increased its presence. Cameras outside the school twitched toward the entrances. The pressure took on a shape that was not brute force, but the slow squeeze of being noticed and contained. On the evening before the hearing, Marina visited Isabella at a temporary foster placement arranged by the agency. The child looked up at her with a quiet suspicion that was less about mistrust and more about the wonder of being allowed to be small. A small meal had been prepared. A coloring book lay on the table, its pages filled with suns and crooked houses. Marina sat down, not to interrogate, but to bring a presence. "You know," she said, choosing her words with the weight of someone who kept promises she could keep. "You're brave." Isabella's eyes widened. "Do you think so?" "I do," Marina said, "and I will do everything I can to keep you safe." The child nodded slowly, then reached for a crayon with an adult's steadiness. "Will the lady come back?" she asked, voice thin. Not if it means you're safe, Marina answered as honestly as she could. That's the goal. That night, Marina sat alone in her car for a long time, the city lights blurring. She thought of the gala, of the push that had ruptured a room's complacency, of Roberto's shout that had opened a single window into a private crisis. She wondered what the man would do once the dust settled, whether his public interruption at the gala would translate into private accountability. The next morning, the court convened in a room with wood-paneled walls and the muffled, respectful air that always precedes a decision meant to be sober. The judge's demeanor was calm. Eduardo presented the emergency petition with all the careful weight of facts, the child's consistent statements, the teacher's observations, the pediatrician's notes, Donna Maria's recording and testimony, the authenticated memory card footage. He asked for immediate protective measures and a custody review to place the child into a safer, more present caregiver's care. Cristiane's counsel objected at every turn, raising procedural questions, insinuating that the child's claims were unreliable, that the recording lacked context, that public speculation had already painted a false picture. The murmurs of the courtroom included the soft rustle of photographers' pages and the distant clink of a pen. It was not resolved in an instant. The preliminary hearing would, as anticipated, buy time. But behind the formal motions, something else unfolded in the hallway, an exchange that would ripple outward. A member of the Mendes Foundation staff, visible and flushed, approached a reporter with a handheld card that read like a credential. "We are cooperating fully," he declared forcefully, and the words were picked up on a recorder, broadcast in a loop on a morning talk show. Roberto Mendes did not attend the hearing in person. Instead, he released a statement through his spokesperson, a terse acknowledgement of the allegations with a promise to cooperate fully with authorities and to protect the best interests of the child. The sentence was shaped to reassure the public, but not to make specific admissions. The public likes the resonance of contrition without consequence. Marina watched these developments from the back of the courtroom, her chest tightening with the exhausted knowledge that power could praise and preserve at the same time. Outside, the press assembled like a small, hungry flock, each outlet angling for the first quote that would lock the narrative. The child's case had become a test of whether the system could keep a child safe when actors with deep resources tried to reframe the story. When the judge issued a temporary protective order, custody transfer to a safe caretaker, supervised visitation only, and an order barring Cristiane from contact pending a full review, the room exhaled collectively. For those who had been working in the long shadows, it felt like a victory. For Marina, it felt like one hinge opening in a door whose many locks remained. But victory, in these matters, is never absolute. The Mendes team announced an appeal. A glossy magazine ran a feature about the perils of quick judgment. Social feeds seethed with divided opinions. Public pressure swayed like wind. Marina returned to her office with the exhaustion that sat in her bones like a dull ache. She filed the judge's order and then turned to the next urgent thing, planning the child's long-term care, arranging therapy, ensuring Donna Maria's legal support, and preparing for the longer judicial process that would test the strength of their evidence. It was in that weary hour, when the immediate danger had been mitigated but the broader fight had only just begun, that an anonymous email landed in Marina's inbox. The subject line contained a single sentence: "Be careful what you do with the recording." Inside, the message was short, typed in a casual font. "You have made this personal. Powerful people do not like to be embarrassed. Some things are worth more than truth. Consider your future." Marina read the message twice. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She thought of Isabella, asleep now in a room where a nightlight painted soft shadows, of Donna Maria in a safe space bed, and Eduardo drafting the next legal move. She did not answer the message. Instead, she opened a new file and wrote a line that would keep her awake and moving for the weeks to come. Document everything. Protect witnesses. Do not be intimidated. Outside, the city carried on. Cars sloshed through puddles. Children in other neighborhoods played with unbroken days. In one small corner of the metropolis, the machinery of justice had been set in motion by a shout at a gala. The shout had been a start. It had not been an end. Marina closed the file and leaned back, thinking of the child with the pale blue dress and the small, apologetic hands. She repeated, in the quiet of an office that now belonged to the case as much as to her, the promise that drew her to her work: to listen, to document, and to stand with those who could not stand alone. She had, by then, a map of the battle ahead. Evidence gathered, witnesses secured, legal avenues charted. But she also had a new knowledge, that power had long arms and patient strategies, and that the fight, even when guided by reliable law and steadfast allies, would be messy, public, and slow. A week later, a file containing a long, shaky video arrived at her desk from an unknown courier. It was labeled in a different hand, the ink smudged by rain. Marina's heart knocked at the sight. She opened the case, and inside was a clip she had not seen, footage taken in a corridor of the Mendes residence, showing an interaction that spoke of tension, a closed door, a child's silhouette shrinking away. It was brief, yet it hinted at a larger truth. At the bottom of the package was a folded note. No signature. A single line. "We saw. Now it's time to choose." Marina held the paper for a long time. The city outside moved. Marina held the paper for a long time. The city outside moved in a blur of headlights and rain-smeared reflections. And inside the quiet file folder, she could feel the weight of other people's lives. The note's message was neither new nor subtle. It was the same pressure that had been pressing from the first day. But the choice it implied was hers. Retreat from a case that had already put strain on her agency and reputation, or press forward and risk the professional and personal costs. She chose to press. She called Eduardo and arranged a meeting for first thing in the morning. She called Carlos and asked him to hold off on publishing anything until the team could lock the chain of evidence. Then she drove, carefully, to the safe location where Dona Maria had been staying. Even on that short drive, Marina rehearsed legal arguments, logistical checklists, and the one thing she could not rehearse, the questions she would need to ask Isabella gently and in a way that would not reopen a wound. Dona Maria's relief when she saw Marina was immediate and raw. The housekeeper had not slept well. Fear had a way of tightening one's throat into a permanent knot. Marina sat with her at a small table and walked through the practical protections Eduardo's office was putting in place. Formal affidavits, witness relocation plans, a temporary work stipend to cover the months of testimony. More than paperwork, Marina offered steadiness, a presence that was consistent and reliable. "People will try to make you doubt yourself," Marina said softly. "That is part of what they do, but what you recorded, what you gave us, it matters. You will not be left alone." Dona Maria nodded, fingers twisting a handkerchief. "I did not want trouble," she said. "I only wanted the child to stop crying at night." "Then you did the bravest thing," Marina answered. "You cared enough to risk the small security of staying quiet. That courage will be part of why she is safe." From there, the week tightened into schedules and legal formalities. Eduardo moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had learned to treat panic with procedure. He obtained protective orders for witnesses, filed motions to preserve digital evidence, and prepared subpoenas for the residents' internal footage and guest lists from the gala. The forensic lab produced reports. The metadata on the memory cards was intact, timestamps aligned with the house's network logs. Audio spectral analysis showed no obvious edits in the file given by Dona Maria. Those technical confirmations mattered. A judge could discount rumor, but a judge could not just as easily ignore a chain of custody that held up under scrutiny. At the same time, Marina and Carlos worked through the social front. Carlos continued background checks and quietly interviewed longtime neighborhood staffers and delivery workers. He found patterns. A nanny who had left abruptly but refused to give a statement publicly out of fear. A groundskeeper who remembered seeing a young girl in the foyer more times than formal records suggested. Each small thread added to the whole, not because one piece would convict, but because together they formed an intelligible picture. In the public sphere, the Mendes PR apparatus kept attempting to reframe the narrative. Columns praised the family's philanthropy. Social posts pointed out Roberto's donations to children's hospitals. The line of argument was clear. Wealthy people do good. Allegations should be tempered by deference. Yet the court does not decide on virtue signals. It decided on evidence and risk to a child. Still, power knows how to unsettle. An anonymous social media smear targeted Dona Maria's character. A well-placed influencer tweeted about rush-to-judgment mentality. The tactics were familiar. Shift attention, pick a soft target, make the defenders appear unbalanced. Marina felt the strain when donors and supervisors expressed unease. She also felt it in the small, private ways a case like this gnawed at friends and family who urged caution. Courage, she had learned, often arrived with costs. The full hearing was scheduled for a few weeks later. It would be a longer, more formal evaluation than the emergency session that had bought temporary safety. The court process would test every document, every testimony, and the expert's ability to speak plainly and convincingly. Eduardo briefed the witnesses extensively, how to give measured answers, how to avoid being led by the defense, and how to prepare for cross-examination tactics designed to discredit memory, motive, and process. Dr. Patricia prepared the psychological evaluation with the attention of someone who understood how vulnerable a child's voice could be in open court. She crafted a plan to present findings in a way that centered the child's welfare and minimized psychological harm during legal proceedings. She recommended that if Isabella's account was to be put on the record, it be done with protective measures in place. Closed circuit testimony, voice alteration, and a guardian ad litem who would ensure the child's comprehension and safety. Luciana, the teacher, rehearsed the chronological notes that had first placed the case on the agency's desk. Her teaching log, dates, observations, photos of drawings, would show the pattern educators had seen for months. Withdrawal, anxiety markers, repetitive themes in art. Luciana's testimony would not be dramatic. It would be steady and clinical. That steadiness would, in the end, be persuasive. Dona Maria's preparation was different. The housekeeper had never given testimony before. She had to be ready for the defense's attempts to paint her as a disgruntled employee seeking attention. Eduardo and Marina worked with her to stick to facts she had personally observed. The nights she recorded, the times she had found Isabella crying and apologizing, the small injuries she had documented with photographs. They rehearsed the questions that would try to unsettle her memory and practiced bringing answers back to the present truth. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse felt like an organism all its own. Wooden benches, low murmurs, the soft rustle of legal pads. Cameras clustered outside and a handful of reporters filled the lobby. Eduardo filed the exhibits at the clerk's desk, each labeled and cross-referenced. The defense arrived in a quiet bundle of confidence. Their motions, prepared weeks in advance, sought to limit certain evidence as hearsay or unduly prejudicial. When the proceeding began, the judge's voice was deliberate, measured. He outlined the legal standard. The paramount concern was the child's welfare. He would consider whether immediate transfer of custody was justified by the risk of harm and whether the evidence supported protective orders. The hearing was neither spectacle nor sermon. It was, in its very nature, a sober weighing of facts under law. Testimonies unfolded in the slow, precise rhythm the court requires. Luciana took the stand and described Isabella's behavior in the classroom with specificity. Her voice did not rise. She spoke as one professional to another. The teacher presented drawings, small houses with barred windows, little figures at the edges, and explained why those images, in context, were cause for concern given the pattern she had seen in other cases. Dr. Patricia testified about the clinical signs that suggested chronic anxiety and the need for trauma-informed care. She explained, without sensational detail, how certain narrative themes in a child's play can indicate repeated exposure to controlling situations, and how therapeutic intervention could both help and prepare a child for any testimony necessary in court. Her words provided the framework the judge needed. This was not a single incident. There were consequences to be addressed comprehensively. Then it was Donna Maria's turn. She walked slowly to the stand, supported by the counsel and fortified by the protection plan Eduardo had arranged. Her voice trembled the first time she spoke the child's name in public, but she looked at the magistrate and spoke clearly about what she had seen and recorded. She explained how she had hidden the memory card out of love for the child and fear for her own safety. Under cross-examination, the defense attempted predictable angles, suggesting that the housekeeper had motives for money or retribution. Donna Maria's answers were factual, dates, times, observations. She did not speculate. The judge watched her closely, not as a juror in a drama, but as a guardian weighing the credibility of a witness. The defense sought to undermine technical evidence next, pointing to the partial nature of the recordings, to the graininess of video, to the difficulty of establishing intent from a single gesture. Eduardo responded with the methodical calm of a seasoned litigator. The recordings were corroborated, the metadata was validated, the child's statements were consistent across multiple contexts, and professionals had independently reached similar conclusions about the child's well-being. The law, he argued, was not about moral certainties, but about risk mitigation when objective indicators suggested harm. The video footage, authenticated and unedited, played in the courtroom in a carefully redacted form that preserved the child's privacy while showing the relevant interactions. The judge viewed it in chambers first, and then allowed the excerpts into evidence with protective orders limiting public dissemination. Watching the footage, the court could see the child's hand slip the push and Roberto's sharp vocal intervention. The clip did not, and could not, explain all motivations or intent, but it placed a series of events in context. There was one more piece to the puzzle that morning. Roberto Mendes chose to be present. He did not take the stand for dramatic effect. Rather, he offered a brief statement of fact, delivered quietly through his counsel. He acknowledged that he had seen the incident at the gala and had intervened publicly, and he admitted, perhaps for the first time in a way that mattered, that the family had failed at certain private responsibilities. He expressed regret that his absence from the child's daily life had allowed others to shape discipline in ways that, in hindsight, had been harmful. He vowed, before the court, to be more present and to ensure the child's safety. That admission might have read as a PR gesture in another context, but here it mattered because it removed one layer of protective cover the defense had used to argue that the child's claims were the result of a household divided by conflicting loyalties. Whether Roberto's promise would translate into daily presence remained to be seen, but for the court, the acknowledgement broke a pattern of polite denial. The defense's final stratagem was to argue that the process had been contaminated by media attention and activist pressure, that the child's narrative had been shaped by an adult agenda. Eduardo countered by demonstrating the checks the agency had followed, recorded interviews with neutral professionals, recorded chain of custody logs, and a protocol that prioritized the child's best interest over public sensation. The judge listened and read the exhibits, weighing each claim with the care of someone who knew the stakes. When he ruled, his voice held the measured finality that makes judicial orders into instruments of protection. He found that the evidence, taken together, showed a credible risk to the child's welfare if she were to return to unsupervised contact with Cristiane. He ordered a change of custody, temporary placement with Roberto under conditions of supervised contact with any third parties, and a comprehensive mandate for family therapy and a professional review of household arrangements. The court also entered a protective order that limited Cristiane's contact pending full review, and that required the family to comply with a court-appointed welfare plan. It was not an absolute erasure of every fear, and the judge's order acknowledged that. It required follow-up, verification, and time, but it also provided the protective framework the child needed to start rebuilding a sense of safety. For the first time since the gala, there was judicial structure aimed at ensuring accountability beyond press statements. In the courthouse hallway, Marina felt an exhausted relief wash through her. She hugged Donna Maria, who was still shaking from the intensity of giving testimony. Luciana offered a small, tired smile. Eduardo's face was stoic. Victories in such cases are rarely triumphant in any euphoric sense. They were, instead, a tiny rebalancing, formal recognition that a child could not be put at risk under the cover of social polish. The weeks after the ruling involved a new kind of labor, the painstaking work of aftercare. The court's order required a coordinated approach. Therapists to begin trauma-informed therapy, a social worker to monitor home visits, an official plan for gradual reintegration if appropriate, and a strict schedule that would hold Roberto to his promise of presence. Roberto, to his credit, stepped into the new role with more than the bare minimum. He stopped delegating the child's daily check-ins entirely to others. He rearranged work commitments, began attending therapy sessions in parallel with family counseling, and made visible efforts to connect with the routines that had been missing from his daughter's life. He was not flawless. His adjustments were sometimes awkward, and his presence felt foreign to the child at first. But he arrived more days than he missed, and he let professionals guide his steps. Donna Maria found a degree of institutional recognition she had never expected. The agency helped secure her employment protections and arranged for financial support while she testified and participated in the legal process. Her courage was acknowledged in a letter from the judge, and the community center where she had once delivered small acts of kindness organized a modest ceremony to thank her. The recognition did not repair everything she had risked, but it affirmed that her choice to speak had been both essential and righteous. Isabella's healing did not follow a straight line. Some evenings she would sleep through the night. Other nights, a small sound, squeak of the floor, a slamming door would trigger a flinch. Therapy proceeded in small steps. Play interventions, the slow rebuilding of trust through consistent caregiver presence, and an emphasis on giving her control over storytelling. Therapists taught her ways to name feelings without being forced to revisit specifics in front of strangers. The professionals reinforced that the child's autonomy over her own narrative was a therapeutic right. Months passed in stages. Monitoring visits showed stability. School reintegration proceeded with sensitivity. Luciana and the school staff coordinated to ensure academic continuity and a safe environment. The legal appeals the defense filed were prolonged, but did not reverse the court's protective posture. Higher courts deferred to the evidence of immediate risk and the child's need for consistent care. During that time, Marina continued to work on other cases, but this one never left her mind. It shaped the way she conducted supervisory meetings and informed training modules. She began offering voluntarily to community organizations. She spoke at a closed seminar for local teachers about patterns to watch for and the importance of early documented reporting. That seminar became the seed of a broader collaboration she would later formalize. Carlos's investigative piece, when it finally ran in a cautious and carefully fact-checked form, did something the PR spin could not. It documented the pattern of evidence with restraint and clarity. He did not sensationalize. He laid out the documents, the authenticated files, the professional opinions, and the steps the agency had taken. The public response was mixed, supportive in many quarters, critical in others, but the factual reporting helped temper the rumors and return attention to the child's welfare instead of the family's image. The Mendes family, under judicial orders and public scrutiny, had to reconcile private images with public responsibility. Roberto used his resources to fund the therapeutic plan and to enroll in parenting programs aimed at high-profile parents who had been absent. He also worked with the agency to fund a community training program for caregivers, an initiative that both contributed resources and responded to the underlying systemic need the case had revealed. Professionals and neighbors sometimes needed more resources to act effectively. The training program eventually became the foundation for something larger. Marina and Eduardo consulted on the curriculum, and Carlos helped write a companion piece about the role of local media in responsible reporting on child welfare. Donna Maria agreed to lend her voice anonymously at first and later as a recognized participant to workshops aimed at domestic workers and caregivers, people who were often close to children's lives but lacking access to legal protection. The slow arc toward restoration included quieter, human moments. One afternoon, months after the hearing, Marina visited the garden where Isabella had been taken for an afternoon of play. The sun was generous, and the air smelled of fresh-cut grass. Isabella, with hair pinned in little clips and a dress less somber than the blue of that first gala, ran to a small wooden bench and climbed up to hand Marina a paper flower she had crafted in therapy. "Thank you for saving me," she said simply, as if the task had been small and inevitable. Marina's throat tightened. "You saved many people, too," she answered. "You helped us do the right thing." They sat a long time, watching sunlight make patterns on the leaves. The child's smile was not a crease-free victory. It was a cautious, emergent warmth. That was enough. In the months that followed, the court's final determinations cemented protective structures. The judge issued a longer-term custody order that placed Isabella with Roberto under conditions that required monitored transition and ongoing therapeutic oversight. The order also barred Cristiane from unsupervised contact, with visitation considered only under tightly controlled professional settings and at a time deemed therapeutically appropriate. The ruling emphasized the need for accountability measures, continued evaluation by child welfare professionals, and sustained support for the child's recovery. There was no theatrical condemnation in the final judgment, only the slow, procedural language of a court that had determined priorities, the child's safety and the restoration of a stable environment. For Marina, the legal victory felt less like a finishing line and more like a clearing in a forest where a path forward could finally be sewn together. Word of the formal order rippled outward. Some criticized the decision as too lenient. Others praised it for balancing protection with the possibility of therapeutic restoration. In the end, the child's daily life improved in ways that mattered most. Fewer sudden absences by those entrusted with care, a schedule without arbitrary punishments, and therapy that allowed a child to name fear and feel it lessen. Marina found herself both celebrated and quietly altered by the case. She received messages from colleagues across the region asking for guidance. She accepted invitations to speak at closed professional forums and to consult on policy proposals for improving witness protections for domestic workers. The recognition was not why she had done the work, yet it created a platform she used to advocate for better systems. There was, too, a personal recalibration. Her nights were less haunted by what-ifs, but they carried new anxieties about how many unseen children still lived in precarious arrangements. The work, she knew, never ended. It shifted, expanded, and circled back. A year after the gala, the agency organized a small celebration in a reclaimed garden behind a community center. It was not a party of triumphalism. It was a gathering to mark a child's regained stability and to acknowledge those who had acted in good faith. The guest list was modest. The teacher Luciana, Dr. Patricia, Eduardo, a handful of agency staff, Carlos the reporter, Donna Maria, who spoke softly into a microphone to an audience that listened with gratitude, and Marina. Roberto attended too, less as a figure under scrutiny and more as a father who had learned imperfectly to show up. Isabella moved through the garden with a skittish joy, handing out paper flowers she had made in therapy to each adult who had, in their own way, kept vigil. When she reached Marina, she looked directly and held out her flower, the same gesture she had made months earlier, now more free and steady. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she said, this time with the confidence of one who had been heard. The crowd clapped, but the sound was small and intimate, nothing like the chandeliers and camera flashes of the gala. It was a sound more like communal breathing, a recognition that safety is a shared responsibility. After the speeches and the soft laughter, Marina walked to the edge of the garden and looked back at the group. She thought of the many hands that had steadied the case, the teacher who had called when she noticed changes, the housekeeper who had buried her fear and then found the courage to speak, the lawyer who had translated social concern into legal measure, the psychologist who had crafted a path for healing, the reporter who had held the story responsibly, and the father who had chosen, finally, to be present. She also thought of the many unseen watchers who had not acted, neighbors who had looked away, systems that sometimes moved too slowly, and the tally of other children waiting for an adult to write possible risk in a notebook. Those thoughts did not diminish the day's relief, they deepened her resolve. She made a quiet decision then, to push for structural changes that would make it less likely for a single vigilant person to carry the burden in isolation. She would draft a proposal for better protective measures, for witnesses, and for training programs to equip schools and the community workers to document and report without fear. In the end, the case left a lasting imprint. It changed policies in small bureaucratic ways. A clearer chain of custody protocol for recordings, a dedicated liaison at the police station for cases involving private households, a subsidized counseling program for domestic workers who testified. Those changes were incremental but meaningful. They formed part of the scaffolding that would support future cases. Isabella's life continued, not as a tale of restoration completed, but as an ongoing story in which she had increasing agency. She went back to school with a different rhythm, a morning ritual established by adults who kept their promises, therapy appointments woven into the week like vitamins, and weekends sometimes filled with the simple, unspectacular presence of a father who had learned to sit through bedtime stories. Donna Maria continued to work with protections in place and no longer had to hide the evidence that had once saved a child. On a rainy afternoon, months later, Marina received a small note in the mail. It was from Isabella, a crayon scrawl of a house with an open door and a little figure smiling on the porch. Attached was a line in childlike handwriting. "I am okay." Marina folded the paper slowly and kept it in a drawer where she stored reminders of why her work mattered. She returned to the agency each morning with a clarity that felt somehow more grounded. The work would always be messy and slow, but it was necessary. She held a new respect for the cumulative power of careful documentation, for the courage of those who bear witness, and for the small but vital interventions that can change a child's life. At the very end, in a quiet moment after the garden day, Marina and Eduardo walked through the empty office together. They spoke not of the headlines, but of the next steps, training programs, stronger protections for witnesses, and the need to continue advocating for children's rights within a system that often privileges wealth and reputation. "We did what we could," Eduardo said, not as a full stop, but as an affirmation. "We will do more," Marina replied. Outside, the city moved on. The gala had become a memory, a pivot point that had started a long process of protection and change. For a child who had once apologized reflexively for spilling juice, daily life was now a place where apologies were not required for being small, and safety was an arranged plan rather than a hope. If there was a lesson threaded through the months, the one that would shape the training, the policies, and the lives touched by the case, it was simple and stubborn. Vigilance matters, documentation matters, and people who step forward must be protected. The rest was procedural, laws to be followed, therapy to be scheduled, and a lifetime of small acts to be done well. If what you saw here resonated, consider supporting verified child protection organizations in your community. They turn concern into action, and your help can strengthen the safety net for children who need someone to listen.